Patient name, Park Yong-Soo, age 86, Korean male, admitted to Harborview Medical Center, Seattle at 9:47 on a Friday night in October, following a severe myocardial infarction at his daughter's hotel room in Belltown. Stabilized but critical. Family unavailable until morning. Daughter on a flight from Chicago. Arrival expected at 6:15 a.m. Patient lucid. Patient asking for someone to sit with him. Patient does not want to die alone in a strange city. I was the ER nurse assigned to him. I was on the final shift of my 33-year career. I was due to retire the following Monday. I had been a nurse at that hospital since I was 25 years old. I had not, in those 33 years, ever sat with a patient through a whole shift the way I sat with Park Yong-Soo on the last night of his life. And I had not, in those 33 years, ever heard a story like the one he told me between 10 p.m. on that Friday and his death at 6:03 on the following Saturday morning. The story was about my father. The story changed every other story in my life. My name is Eun-ha Choi. Americans call me Anna. I am 58 years old. I am Korean American. My family came to Seattle from Seoul in February of 1973 when I was 7 years old. My father was a tailor here for 25 years. He died in 1998 of lung cancer at 65. I had thought, in the 26 years since his death, that I knew the shape of who my father had been. I did not. A dying man in a hospital bed told me, in the last 7 hours of his life, the shape I had not known. I want to tell you what he told me, what I did with it, and what 28 people did together in a small room in Seattle 6 months later. Let me tell you about my father, Choi Jun-ho. Born in 1933 in a small town outside Seoul, the son of a calligraphy teacher. He grew up under Japanese occupation, lived through the Korean War as a teenager, finished his university degree at Yonsei in 1956, and became, at 28, an assistant professor of chemistry. He married my mother Soo-yeon, a piano teacher, in 1961. They had my older sister Min-jung in 1963. They had me in 1965. We lived in a small apartment near the Yonsei campus. My father wore a suit and tie every day of my early childhood. My mother taught piano lessons in our living room. I remember sitting on the floor under the piano while her students played. The world smelled in those years like coffee and chalk and the wax my father used on his shoes. In February of 1973, my parents woke us up at 3 in the morning. My mother packed a single suitcase for each of us. My father carried 2 larger ones. We left the apartment with the lights on, the way you leave when you do not want the neighbors to know you are leaving. We took a taxi to the airport. We flew, with paperwork I now know my father had spent 4 months preparing in secret, to Tokyo. We spent 6 weeks in a small Tokyo apartment that belonged to a man my father called an old friend. We then flew to Seattle, where another old friend met us at the airport with 3 winter coats from a Goodwill, because we had landed in a Pacific Northwest February in clothes meant for an apartment we no longer lived in. I asked my parents, in the years that followed, why we had left. The answers were always vague. My father had been in a difficult position politically. There had been problems at the university. The new government had been not friendly to people like Baba. I was a child. I accepted the explanations. By the time I was old enough to ask harder questions, my father had become a tailor on King Street in the International District, and the man who had been an assistant professor of chemistry seemed like a story we did not bring up anymore, the way some families do not bring up bankruptcies. My father was a quiet man. He worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 25 years. He hemmed pants. He took in suit jackets. He fitted wedding dresses for white American brides whose mothers tipped him $3 and called him the little Korean man on King Street. He never complained. He never raised his voice. He never, in 25 years, spoke about Korea except to praise my mother's kimchi or to gently correct my older sister and me when our pronunciation got sloppy. He died on a Tuesday in October of 1998 in a hospice in Capitol Hill with my mother holding his hand, and the last thing he said to me was, in Korean, "Eun-ha, take care of your mother, be good to your patients, Be a quiet, careful person. That is the best kind of person to be. I had been 33. I had been an ER nurse for 8 years. I had buried him as the man I had known, the tailor, the chemistry teacher who had stopped being one, the quiet, careful person. Park Yong-Soo arrived at Harborview at 9:47 on a Friday night in October. I was 3 days from retirement. I had given my notice in August. My replacement, a young nurse named Imani, was already shadowing my last week. The retirement cake was in the break room freezer. The card had already been signed by half the night shift. Park came in by ambulance from a hotel in Belltown, where he had collapsed in the bathroom of his daughter's room while visiting her. His daughter, who lived in Chicago, was on a flight back. The estimated arrival was 6:15 the next morning. Park was 86. He had had 2 prior heart attacks. The attending, a kind, very tired cardiologist named Dr. Reyes, told me, when I came on at 10, that Park was not going to make it to morning. The medication was buying time. Park knew. Dr. Reyes had told him. Park's chart said he spoke English and Korean. The chart said his preferred language for end-of-life conversations was Korean. We did not have, at that moment, a Korean-speaking chaplain on call. I was the only Korean-speaking nurse in the unit that night. I told Dr. Reyes I would sit with him. I told Imani to handle my other patients. I went into Park's room with a small plastic chair, a cup of water, and the small Korean New Testament I keep in my locker, in case it was useful. I sat down. I introduced myself in Korean. I said, 할아버지, 제 이름은 초이운하입니다. 걱정하지 마세요. 제가 옆에 있을게요. Grandfather, my name is Choi Eun-ha. Do not worry. I am here with you. Park, who had been lying very still with his eyes closed, opened his eyes. He looked at me. He said my name back to me. He said, Choi Eun-ha. Then he asked, very carefully, in the slow Korean of a man who had not spoken the language much in many decades, Choi Eun-ha, newi abeojiga Choi Jun-hoya? Choi Eun-ha, is your father Choi Jun-ho? I said yes. Park closed his eyes. He did not speak for almost a full minute. When he opened them again, they were full of tears. He said in Korean, in the voice of a man who has carried something for 50 years, and is finally in the room with someone he can put it down with, Eun-ha-ya, your father saved my life in 1972. I have been looking for you for 26 years. I have to tell you everything before I die. Please sit closer. Please. I will not give you every detail of what Park told me over the next 7 hours. There are pieces of it that belong to him. There are pieces of it that belong to my father. There are pieces of it that belong to 9 people who have since asked me not to share their full names in any public telling. I will give you the shape of it. My father, Choi Jun-ho, was not just a chemistry professor who lost his job under the Park Chung-hee dictatorship. My father was the central organizer of a small underground network in Seoul between 1971 and February of 1973 that helped student activists and political dissidents, people who had been blacklisted, people who were being followed by the KCIA, people whose arrest was imminent, escape from South Korea to Japan, and from Japan to the United States or Canada. My father used the network of his university colleagues, his church, and several old friends in Tokyo to forge documents, find safe houses, arrange flights, and in some cases, accompany people as far as Busan to put them on boats. He had done this, Park said, for 37 people in 3 years. Park had been the 11th. In April of 1972, Park had been a 28-year-old graduate student in political science. He had written, foolishly, a small essay critical of the regime in a student newspaper. He had been arrested. He had been held for 3 days in a small room. He had been released with a warning, but he had been told, plainly, that he was being watched. He had a young wife who was 4 months pregnant. He had been afraid to go home. A friend had introduced him that week to a man named Choi Jun-ho, who had given Park and his wife 2 small bags, 2 sets of false documents, the name of a fishing boat captain in Busan, the address of an apartment in Osaka, and $47 in American money. Park and his wife had been out of Korea within 72 hours. They had crossed to Japan that Sunday. They had flown to Chicago, where Park had a cousin, 3 months later. Their son had been born in Chicago in October of 1972. The same week, Park later realized, that my mother had begun packing our things in Seoul. Park had not known, when he left Korea, that my father was the head of the network. He had known him as a friend of a friend who could help. Park had not known my father's full name. He had known only that the man he had met had been a quiet professor with calm hands and a steady voice, who had told him, in their one and only meeting, "Park C, do not thank me. Get your wife out of this country. Have your child. Be a good father. That is the only thank you I will accept." In February of 1973, the network had been compromised. A young man, Park said, had been arrested and had named names under interrogation. My father had received a phone call from a colleague at 3 in the morning. He had been on a list of 7 names being rounded up that day. My father had had 3 hours, my mother later told me, to decide whether to go alone, which would have given the rest of us a chance, or to take us all and risk being stopped at the border. He had taken us all. The border had been crossed. The plane had taken off. The 4 of us had made it. 2 of the other 7 men on that list, Park said, had not. One had been arrested at his apartment that morning. The other had been arrested at Kimpo Airport 4 days later. Both had been imprisoned for 10 years. One had died in custody. The other had been released in 1983 and had lived another 19 years, and had, Park said, looked for Choi Jun-ho for the rest of his life. He had died in 2002, in Toronto, without ever finding him. Park said, "Eun-haya, your father saved my life. He saved my wife. He saved my son. He saved 35 other people I have spent the last 20 years trying to find." I knew in 1998 that he had been in Seattle. I knew because someone called me. The someone had come to America the same way we did, through your father's help. The someone said your father had just died. I called information. I could not find a phone number. I did not have your married name. I did not know you were a nurse. I have been looking for you, in my small way, for 26 years. Tonight, I am dying in your hospital. Tonight, you are the nurse who came into my room. I am telling you because someone has to know. Your father was a great man. Greater than the tailor everyone in this country thought he was. Greater, even, than the man you knew. Please, tell your mother, tell your sister, tell your children. Do not let him die unknown a second time. Park lived through the night. He was not in pain in the last hours. I held his hand for the last 40 minutes. He spoke a little in Korean and a little in English. He told me about his wife, who had died in 2011. He told me about his son, who was the daughter on the airplane from Chicago. Park's son had transitioned in his 50s, was now Park's daughter, and Park had taken 5 years to accept it and had spent the last 7 years apologizing for the 5. He told me he was proud of her. He told me he hoped she would meet me. He told me she carried his story now, and that I should tell her, when she arrived, that her grandfather Choi had been the man who got the family out of Korea. He died at 6:03 in the morning. His daughter arrived at 6:22. Her name was June, after Park's wife, who had been named Jun-hee. I told her, in the small, empty waiting room at the end of the hall, what her father had told me. I told her my own father's name. She cried. She held me. She said, "My father has spoken your father's name in our house once a year, on the anniversary, for as long as I have been alive. He was a kind of saint in our house. We didn't know he was a real person until you came in tonight." I went home at 7:30. I called my husband David from the parking lot. I told him I needed him to come to my mother's facility with me. I told him I would explain in the car. He did not ask questions. David has been married to me for 31 years. He has not, in all those years, asked questions when the time for asking questions was wrong. That morning, he just got in the car. My mother was 84 years old and lived in an assisted living facility in Wallingford. She had soft, early-stage dementia. She had good days and bad days. On her bad days, she did not always know who I was. On her good days, she remembered everything she had ever known. There was no way to predict walking in. I walked in at 8:15 on a Saturday morning in October, 26 years after my father had died, and I sat down on the edge of my mother's bed, and I held both of her hands, and I said in Korean, "엄마, do you remember a man named Park Yong-Soo? He was a graduate student in 1972. Baba helped him leave Korea. Do you remember?" My mother looked at me. Her eyes were the eyes of an 84-year-old woman who had been having a foggy morning. They cleared. They focused. They became, in front of me, the eyes of the 33-year-old woman my mother had been when she had packed a suitcase in Seoul in February of 1973. She said in Korean, in the voice of a woman who had been waiting half a century to be asked, "Unha, sit down. We need to talk." My mother told me, for the next 2 hours, what my father had made her promise. He had told her, on the plane from Tokyo to Seattle in 1973, that he did not want Minjung and me to grow up in a country thinking of him as a hero. He did not want, my mother said, to become a story. He had seen too many men become stories. He had wanted us to grow up thinking of him as a tailor. He had wanted, more than anything, for us to think that the most extraordinary thing about him was that he was ordinary. He had told my mother that if we ever found out, after he was gone, it would have to come from somewhere else. He could not have it come from her. She had promised. She had kept the promise for 51 years. She said, near the end of the conversation, "Yoon-ha, now you know. Now you can decide what to do. He is dead. The promise was only mine. You did not promise anyone anything. The story is yours now. Do what you think is right. I am tired. I want to take a nap." I sat with her until she fell asleep. I called my sister Minjung in Vancouver. I told her, on the phone, in Korean, what had happened in the hospital. She started crying before I had finished the third sentence. She said, "Anna, I am driving down. I will be there by 6. She arrived at 5:45. Minjung and I spent the next 3 weekends going through the boxes our father had kept in his small storage unit on Beacon Hill, which my mother had paid the rent on every month for 26 years, and which we had never, in those 26 years, fully gone through. We had assumed it held old tailoring supplies, old receipts, old immigration paperwork. It had held some of that. It had also held 3 notebooks, in Korean, in our father's handwriting. The first notebook contained 37 names. Each name had a date, a city of departure, a city of arrival, and a small notation about the person's circumstances: pregnant wife, 2 children, blacklisted for newspaper article, sister already arrested. The notebook had been kept, my sister and I realized, as my father's private accounting of the lives he had been responsible for. The second notebook contained the names and last known addresses of the people who had helped him from inside the network: fellow professors, a priest at his church, a fishing boat captain, the cousin in Tokyo. Most of these people were now dead. The third notebook contained letters, 31 letters, each one written to my father between 1974 and 1998 by people he had saved, who had found out by various small underground means where he was living. He had never written back to a single one. The letters had been kept, addressed and unopened, in a small wooden box at the back of the storage unit. Minjung and I opened them. We opened all 31. Each one was a thank you. Some of them were 1 paragraph. Some of them were 8 pages. They came from Chicago, from Toronto, from Los Angeles, from Boston, from Berlin, from Sydney, from Edinburgh. They had all reached my father. He had read none of them. He had kept them all. He had decided, somewhere inside himself, that opening them would have made him a different man than he had decided to be in America. He had wanted, more than anything, to be a tailor. I have thought in the year since about why he chose that. I think it was something like this. My father had been a man who had risked everything for 37 strangers in a country that was being torn apart. He had succeeded. He had paid for it with his career, his apartment, his city, his language, his identity. He had arrived in America at 39 years old with nothing but a wife and 2 daughters. He had decided, I think, that the heroism had been one chapter and that the rest of the book had to be a different chapter, lived in a different room. He had not refused the letters out of shame. He had refused them out of a kind of stubborn, quiet privacy. He had paid the price for 37 lives. He did not want to be paid back. He just wanted to be left alone with the hem of someone's pants and a quiet Saturday afternoon. 6 months after Park Yong-Soo died in my emergency room, in April of the following year, my sister Min Jung and I held a small memorial for my father in a community room at the Korean Cultural Center in Seattle. We invited everyone we had been able to find from the notebooks, the people themselves, where they were still alive, and their children or grandchildren, where they were not. We invited Park's daughter June, who flew in from Chicago. We invited the families of the 2 men who had been arrested in February of 1973, both of whom we had located through the second notebook. 28 people came. They came from 7 cities. The oldest was 91, a woman my father had escorted personally to Busan in November of 1971, who now lived in Vancouver with her great-grandchildren. The youngest was 16, a high school sophomore from Toronto whose grandfather had been the man who died in 1983, 10 years into his prison sentence, never knowing my father's name. We did not have a ceremony exactly. We sat in a circle. We took turns. Each person, or each family, told their story. They told the version of my father they had known. The man in a coat at a bus station, the man in a coffee shop near the university, the man at a fishing dock in Busan at 5 in the morning, the man who had handed a pregnant woman an envelope of cash and told her not to thank him. 28 people described 28 different small encounters with the same quiet man. The encounters had all happened in 3 years. The man had lived another 25 years after that, on King Street, taking in suit jackets and hemming pants and saying nothing. At the end of the gathering, the 91-year-old woman from Vancouver stood up. She held a small wooden box. She walked to the front of the room. She said in Korean, "Choi Jun-ho-si did not let any of us thank him while he was alive. He kept our letters in a box. Today, his daughters have given those letters back to us. We are going to give him something in return. Each of us has written 1 new letter. We are going to read them now, one at a time, into this empty box. We are going to seal the box. We are going to give it to Choi Jun-ho's daughters. They will keep it. Their children will know. Their grandchildren will know. The quiet man on King Street will not be quiet any longer in this family. We owe him that, finally, after 50 years." We read the letters. We sealed the box. The box is on a shelf in my house in Seattle. I look at it every morning when I drink my coffee. It is a small wooden box. It is the loudest thing in my home. I want to tell you what I have decided about my father, 2 years later, and what I have decided about my own retirement, which began the Monday after Park Yong-Soo died. My father was a tailor. My father was also a man who saved 37 lives in 3 years, and then chose, for the remaining 25 years of his life, to stop being the man who had saved them. Both of those facts are him. Neither one is more him than the other. The tailor and the rescuer are the same man. The rescuer made the tailor possible. The tailor honored the rescuer. The rescuer chose to disappear into the tailor. The disappearance was, I have come to understand, the final act of the rescue. He saved 37 people, and then he saved himself by becoming someone smaller. He was, in his quietness, the most generous person I have ever known about. Park Yong-Soo gave me my father back. Park gave me a father I had not known I had. Park did this on the last shift of my career, in the small, windowless room where I had spent 33 years sitting with strangers. Park was, in some way I cannot fully explain to you, the final patient my father sent me. Park was my father's last gift. My father had spent 25 years quietly raising a daughter who would, on a Friday night in October at the age of 58, sit with an old Korean man through a long night and let him say what he had been waiting 50 years to say. My father, in his stubborn, quiet privacy, had built the nurse who would receive his own delayed thank you on his behalf. Some of the long arcs in this life are very long. Some of them are 60 years. Mine was one of those. If this story landed for you, drop the word tailor in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, Full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. First, the quietest people in your life are sometimes the largest. Do not mistake silence for the absence of a story. Some people lived their story before you met them and chose, for reasons of their own, not to repeat it. You owe those people the small courtesy of imagining that the room behind their quietness is a large room. You may not get to walk into it. Imagine it anyway. It will change how you sit at the table with them. Second, if you are a nurse, or a hospice worker, or a chaplain, or anyone who sits with strangers at the end of their lives, be patient with the long shifts. Be patient with the patients who want to tell you something. The thing they want to tell you may not be about themselves. It may be about you. You may not know it yet. The story you have been waiting your whole life to hear may be carried, sometimes, by a stranger from another city who has been carrying it half a century, looking for the right room to set it down in. Make your room the right room. Sit close. Listen. The shifts are long for a reason. Look after each other. I'll see you in the next one.